back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking to Nick Redfern. His webpage is nickredfern.com, and I'm going to say new book, except he has a new book coming out in June. This book, which came out in December, is The NASA Conspiracies, The Truth Behind the Moon Landing, Censored Photos, and the Face on Mars. And don't worry, we're going to get to all of that today. Nick, there was a question in the chat room, which I thought was pretty good. Has there been any instances of cataracts with individuals who have been in the space shuttles? And I know that program isn't as old, but it's a good question.
No, I'm truthfully not sure about that, Rita. I honestly don't know. I mean, it's worth looking into. Bear in mind, though, the space shuttle actually only goes up, literally about 150 miles. A lot of people don't know that. It doesn't, the moon is 250,000 miles away. The space shuttle doesn't even go up as far as, Dallas to Houston into space. But what it does, it has this payload bay where they then release satellites and launch them. But the shuttle itself doesn't go that high. So, that might have a factor on it as well. So.
They definitely are not going through that Van Allen belt, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. 150 miles really isn't any distance. That's, the space shuttle is in very, very low Earth orbit when it goes up. But it launches things, into higher orbit or out into the solar system and probes and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Before the break, I mentioned maybe we could talk about any of the astronauts having UFO encounters. I know Buzz Aldrin, in his book, I guess it came out a couple of years ago, infers that he had seen something, but doesn't say, well, I saw a UFO. He just saw something out there in space. But have any of the astronauts come forward to say that they've had any kind of alien UFO encounters?
Oh, yeah. One of the most famous ones, certainly, was Gordon Cooper, who was one of the original Mercury astronauts, the Mercury program being one of the early NASA program to put men into space. And Cooper's interest and involvement in UFOs actually predates his work as a NASA astronaut. When you become an astronaut, or you apply to become an astronaut, it isn't just a case of thinking, I want to be an astronaut, and you apply for the job. You have to have a background in things like aviation or pilot, something along those lines, or physicist. And that's exactly what Gordon Cooper had. He was a very skilled U.S. Air Force pilot, and he served in the U.S. military for a number of years. And in the early 1950s, he was stationed in West Germany with the Air Force. Bear in mind this was the height of the Cold War, so you had these Western powers, sort of patrolling the border between Europe and Russia, just basically, keeping the Russians at bay and reminding them that we were watching, and vice versa. The Russians did exactly the same. But on one particular occasion, when Cooper was on patrol with a number of air crews over West Germany, they reported seeing these very high-flying objects that looked like classic flying saucers. They were described as circular, saucer-shaped, gleaming silver color, moving very, very fast, and it's kind of like literally a squadron of them. And these sightings went on for several days, and it became clear to the air crews that whatever these objects were that were continually flying over West German airspace, they weren't showing any wings, no tails, no evidence of propellers or engines, anything at all, just purely and simply circular-shaped objects. Well, after this occurred for several days, the sightings just came to a sudden halt, and all the people involved were essentially told that, you all made a mistake. They weren't flying saucers. You're actually seeing high-flying seed pods, which is, a very bizarre and strange explanation. The idea that trained military pilots...
Like plant seed pods?
Yeah.
Plant seed pods?
Yeah, the military's argument was that the military's position was that instead of seeing large objects at a distance, the pilots were seeing small objects, seed pods, close up, and mistakenly thinking that they were seeing very large objects at a long way away. which is bizarre and stupid. You know, the idea that trained pilots, military pilots, one of who would become a NASA astronaut, would make such a stupid mistake. You know, it's kind of like looking out the window on a plane when you're going on your holidays and seeing, I don't know, a speck of dust outside the window 6 feet away and assuming it's a 40-foot flying saucer a mile away. You know, nobody would do that, you know. You don't have to be a pilot. You know, I mean, you have to be just a regular person wouldn't make that mistake. And so this kind of stayed with Cooper, you know, all his life. It sort of deeply impressed him that he had this experience. Then in 1958, he was working out at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and two of his colleagues were involved in filming and shooting photographs of aircraft coming into land at a dry lake bed at Edwards. And they actually photographed and filmed a flying saucer that briefly touched down on the lake bed at the time they were doing the filming early one morning. And they raced back to the base, gave the footage to Cooper. He called the Pentagon up immediately, and they said, send the footage immediately, but do not print the negatives. And Cooper basically said, well, they told me not to print the negatives, so I didn't, but they didn't say anything about not looking at the negatives. So that's exactly what he did, and he said they showed this sort of typical flying saucer. And again, this had a really deep impression on him, and when he obviously joined NASA, you know, he was in a prime position to talk about his UFO experiences even further when he left NASA, because he was an astronaut who'd had encounters and experience and knowledge talking about UFOs. And in 1978 and 1985, when there was lobbying and pressure put on the United Nations to set up an independent UFO study program, Gordon Cooper actually lent his support to this project, which ultimately didn't come to fruition, unfortunately. But the very fact that, you know, you had a NASA astronaut saying, in his own words, I believe UFOs are real and they're from somewhere else, you know, that was pretty profound to hear that coming out of a NASA astronaut's mouth.
I had interviewed Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who was the Gemini 14, the one after, no, Apollo 14, the one after the bad one. And asked him whether he had seen any UFOs or anything like that, and he said not during his mission.
Yeah.
It was like,
no, that's right.
And he's totally a believer too.
Yeah, that's right. Edgar Mitchell, he piloted the Apollo 14 mission to the moon, which landed in February 1971. And Mitchell's an important person because although he didn't have his own experience on the moon, since going to the moon, and certainly in the last 10 years or so, he's been a major champion of the whole UFO phenomenon and the idea that UFOs are real. He's done a number of very good TV and radio interviews speaking openly and quite graphically about what he's learned about the UFO phenomenon. For example, he actually grew up around the Roswell, New Mexico area, and because of his background as an astronaut, you know, people respected him and were willing to talk to him. And he's gone on record as saying he spoke to a number of old-timers from Roswell, military people who were involved in the event, who told him that, yes, aliens crashed at Roswell. And so what Mitchell did, because he realized there was this sort of wall of secrecy behind which the Roswell story was being hidden, he actually did something that pretty much none of us can really do unless we're somebody, you know, like an astronaut. What he did, Mitchell actually approached the Pentagon and asked for a meeting specifically with the Intelligence Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And incredibly, he actually got the meeting. He got a face-to-face meeting. He told them his story about what he'd been told about Roswell, that, yes, it was real, that somebody in the government was hiding it, and he wanted to know what was going on. And he confirmed that he actually got confirmation from an admiral that what he'd been told was true, that, yes, aliens did crash at Roswell. Now, Mitchell mentioned this on a number of TV and radio shows, and it was kind of treated with interest. But what should have happened, in my mind, but what didn't happen, is that there should have been some sort of in-depth, you know, almost like a Woodward and Bernstein investigation, you know, where the major news outlets would have followed this story to the ultimate degree. You know, there was nobody, you know, in sort of the main major news outlets, whether newspapers or TV, who said to, you know, Mitchell, tell us who you spoke to, tell us what was going on, how do we track these people down, and can you give us insights who to speak to in the Pentagon? It was almost like the media didn't want to touch it. And I kind of find that suspicious. I sometimes wonder if the media is actually being manipulated to a degree, not to have sort of a hands-on approach to this subject in certain sensitive issues. And that's actually what it comes across like. It's like whether it's Watergate or weapons of mass destruction and things like this, the media has been all over these stories. When it comes to something like a NASA astronaut saying, I got a briefing from people inside the Pentagon about Roswell, they should have been over that like a rash, but they weren't. It was almost like it was portrayed as almost like a jokey story for the end of the news, and then it vanished. And I do find that kind of curious.
And then more information about Britney Spears or whoever, Tiger Woods,
exactly,
to take your mind off of anything that might be revealing about what's going on in our country.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. The earlier astronaut Clark that you were talking about, you might not know the answer to this, but I was curious. Did he tell NASA when he was applying to be an astronaut that he had this UFO encounter earlier in his life?
Gordon Cooper. I mean. Yeah.
Yes.
To the best of my knowledge, no, he didn't. Now, to what extent that might have had who knows whether it would have had a positive or negative bearing. I think that's dependent on who within NASA, you speak to in relation to UFOs. I mean, I'm pretty sure, this is an important issue. I'm pretty sure that most people within NASA don't have any inkling of a cover-up and aren't involved in any cover-up. They're legitimate, normal employees doing valid, worthy scientific and technical investigations and launching probes and projects, into outer space, etc. Kind of like, if you join the CIA, you're not automatically briefed on what happened at Roswell. You're told what you need to know to do your job, and that applies with NASA as well, being a government agency. They don't spill the beans on every secret under the sun just because you start working for them. That's how secrets are kept, by just sharing with data with people that need it. So, in other words, I think, to go back to your question about whether Cooper said anything about his experience at the time, I don't think he did. But, if he did tell anyone, if they weren't cleared to know, they might just find it interesting or they'd dismiss it. It might have been the case if there were people who really knew the truth, they might think, well, he's got a belief in this, he's an astronaut, he might be somebody we can share the facts with. But that doesn't seem to have happened. So, in other words, it seems that his position as an astronaut didn't have any influence on those in the know at NASA, bringing him into the secret fold, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Any other astronauts? Yeah,
there's a strange story I tell in the book about how the Gemini 4 mission in 1965, when the astronauts went up on that particular mission, there have been rumours that they had equipment on board to actually track for UFOs. Now, this is sort of one of these stories that's almost been like an apocryphal type story or a friend of a friend story. So what I did, I used the Freedom of Information Act to try and find out more about this, and actually got hold of FBI documents, officially declassified documents, I should stress, from 1965 that actually had a direct bearing upon this story. Now, one of the astronauts on the Gemini 4 mission was James McDivitt. And so, we have a name, we have a flight, we know when it flew into space, etc. And the particular story that I chased down and actually got verified through FBI files was that the FBI and NASA, at the time of the Gemini 4 mission, was deeply concerned that there was some sort of, for want of a better term, a whistleblower within NASA who was revealing secret classified information on UFOs to certain people from the old NICAP group, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which was kind of like today's MUFON. It was like a private, a general public type group investigating UFOs. And both NASA and the FBI got wind of this story to the effect that there was an insider who had access to to NASA secrets on UFOs who was revealing the information to people on the outside, UFO researchers. And so they both took steps, NASA and the FBI, to look into this further. and they managed to speak to two researchers who had indeed received correspondence from this particular person in NASA. And of course, I'm sure, if the FBI sort of flexes its muscles and knocks on your front door and says, we want to know who you spoke to, back in the 60s, they probably would have said, okay, and that's exactly what happened. They did speak to the FBI and said, well, we have had correspondence with this person, and he sends us information, sends us pictures, and apparently, as a demonstration of the extent to which this whistleblower was frightened, apparently, when he used to send the letters, he would literally pull out one of his hairs off his head and kind of stick it to the back of the envelope, and then when it had arrived at the other end, he would ask the guys, is the hair still there? And if it was missing, he figured that meant somebody had intercepted the letter and opened it. So whoever this person was, he was extremely paranoid. But one of the things...
Good thing they didn't have DNA back then.
Well, no, they didn't have that, but it was more the idea of if the hair was missing, he figured somebody had surreptitiously opened and then resealed the envelope after seeing what was inside it. But basically what it came down to in terms of the Gemini 4 mission was that this informant at NASA told the NICAP people that there were sophisticated technologies and devices on board to track for UFOs in space. So, in other words, this is a story that hasn't been verified in terms of NASA saying, yes, we were tracking for UFOs, but we do have the official documents declassified under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act from from the FBI, showing how everybody and his brother in the intelligence community was chasing down this story to try and find who this whistleblower was, which would suggest, because they treated it very seriously, that there was a high degree of truth to the story.
Interesting. Nick, I'm going to shift gears on you here because we're running out of daylight, as they say. And I have a lot. We haven't even gotten to the moon, the faces on Mars or anything, which we totally have to get to, but I don't want to go there yet. There have also been rumors about the shuttle explosion, like the Challenger, that might have been planned and executed by NASA. Part of me goes, huh? What?
Yeah, this is
What's
a
with
weird
that?
story. Yeah, I mean, when the Challenger space shuttle exploded in January 1986 on takeoff, it was a very tragic, terrible event for everybody involved, and certainly the families of the people who were there watching the launch as well. And, when something like a space shuttle explodes, it's like the Apollo rocket, the whole point of the space shuttle is that to get it into space, you need a lot of fuel. You need a huge rocket boosters and a huge fuel tank, and that's exactly what the shuttle had. The shuttle is attached and then becomes detached after it takes off. And what happened, of course, was that the fuel tank, when the fuel tank's ignited, you don't stand any chance. It's just like a huge explosion. That's what happened. And the official conclusion, which I actually do agree with, was that it was a tragic accident. I don't think there's little doubt that it was a tragic accident. However, a lot of people don't realize that there was a very deep and secret investigation, a combined NASA-FBI investigation of the space shuttle disaster, purely and simply because a number of people were saying that there was some sort of conspiracy afoot, and that it wasn't an accident, that it was literally a result of sabotage. Now, the FBI NASA file on this, again, has been released through the terms of the Freedom of Information Act. You can actually download the file as a PDF from the FBI's own website. They've put it on there for people to read now. But it tells a fascinating story of how all across the United States, East Coast, middle part of the country, even not far from where we live, right in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and on the West Coast, people were contacting the FBI, telling actually very similar stories where they said that when they were watching the explosion on the TV, they thought they could see what looked like a projectile either hitting the shuttle or hitting the fuel tank, the main fuel tank. One of the people who related this story, who was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, was a man who worked in the video industry but transferring footage from TV and computerizing it. That was his job at the time. And he told the FBI, and the FBI said, well, can we come round and look at your footage and, you can give us your analysis. And that's literally what they did. They turned up on his doorstep, not from an ominous perspective, but said, can we come in and look at the footage that you're talking about? So they sat down with him, and he, was expressing concerns, as were the other people, about things like laser-guided weaponry or laser beam weaponry being, with the shuttle being targeted. And this, deeply worried the FBI. Was it some sort of terrorist attack, or, who was doing it? So the FBI, after speaking to the witnesses, they literally went knocking on the doors of the scientific departments of the Air Force, Army, and the Navy, and got full classified briefings at the time on the then current status of laser-guided weaponry research. One of the stranger things, which actually brings a UFO link into it all, is that one of the people who contacted the FBI and said that this was definitely sabotage was a woman, a contactee, who claimed to have been in kind of like mind-to-mind contact with aliens. And she told the FBI quite openly that these higher entities she was speaking with had told her that the shuttle was sabotaged, and eerily in a situation that paralleled almost what the other people were saying. So this sort of takes it down a UFO path. Now, there's also another UFO angle to the story as well that I talk about in the book. One of the astronauts on the space shuttle disaster, the Challenger one, when it blew up, was a man named Ellison Onizuka. And Onizuka, prior to becoming an astronaut, was in the U.S. Air Force. And he went on record as saying that in 1973 with the Air Force, he was basically given a briefing and shown film footage of an alien autopsy. So in other words, it's a very weird story where you have all these tales about conspiracy and laser-guided weapons aimed at the shuttle tank, etc. Then you have one of the astronauts talking about seeing an alien autopsy, and then you have a woman, a contactee, claiming to have had contact with aliens who said it was sabotaged. And there's even a stranger third point that relates to UFOs as well. One of the people who was actually going to take part on that flight was none other than the country singer John Denver, who had a deep interest in astronomy and spaceflight. And he actually took and passed both NASA's physical and mental health evaluations to allow him to go into space. And he was due to go on the flight, but fate intervened and he couldn't make it. But what's interesting is that John Denver actually grew up and was born and grew up in the town of Roswell. So it's almost like you have these sort of weird fate-related issues all surrounding this particular flight. And when you look at all the different things collectively, it's a very weird story.
And then he ends up dying, and you could almost say mysteriously.
Yeah, so it's a very, very odd story. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I had heard, I had never heard anything about a conspiracy associated with the first shuttle crash or explosion, but I heard not much after the second one exploded, all kinds of conspiracy stuff about they were up there and they were taking, satellite photos for the government and blah, 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 and they sent the files down, and because they knew too much about what was, what the government wanted them to take pictures of, they had to eliminate them all. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Yeah, there are a few stories like that. My main argument against the idea that, I could understand that, terrorists or unfriendly nations would do this, but, to me, I don't find it credible at all that the governments would do it, because why go to the trouble of destroying a space shuttle? If you want to take somebody out, why not do it, in a way that's less, is less likely to bring it to people's attention, like a car accident or, an induced heart attack. Governments, there's medicine that exists now that, can assassinate people and make it look like a stroke or a heart attack. Why go to the extent of destroying a space shuttle, which is only going to bring more and more attention to the event? So, I think whether it's valid that some of these explosions could have been due to terrorism or unfriendly nations, I don't rule that out, because the FBI did launch this extensive study and, they had some intriguing information that people brought to their attention. But I think the idea that NASA or the government would do it, I don't think that has credibility, because, it's actually just undermines their entire program. And in fact, with the space shuttle, when the first one exploded, Challenger, the entire fleet was grounded for a couple of years. You know, it brought the entire NASA space program to a halt. So if there was any need to get rid of the astronauts on NASA's part, which I don't see as credible, as I said, why almost kick yourself in the teeth and ground your entire space shuttle program as well? It's, you know, something would have been done in a less outlandish way, I think.
At this point in time, back then, I didn't think so much. At this point in time, I think, well, what else was going on in the world at that point in time? I mean, this is like totally taking it to conspiracy to the max. What else was going on in the world at that point in time that the government maybe wanted to draw media attention away from? So we have this big thing happen over here so we can talk about it for weeks, and we don't pay attention to this other thing, which, you know, is really going on.
Yeah.
You know, like Britney Spears, you know.
Yeah, she's good at creating diversions, I think, when things go wrong in the world. Let's see, a new video comes out or there's a new scandal or whatever. So.
You know, or the Hilton sisters or what, I mean, weird stuff that who cares about.
Well, that's the thing, but a lot of people do, you know. It's like the world's become almost dumbed down in the last few years, you know. It's we're definitely seeing that, where, you know, it's like in schools today. Kids, you know, they don't, not to speak badly, but the education system caters at sort of minimal level that, you know, it's, people don't know places in the world where countries are. You know, they don't really know too much about history, but they know all about, you know, Britney Spears or whoever, so, or what's happening on, you know, I know, Dancing with the Stars or whatever. So.
Or they're really good at playing Super Mario Brothers or some Halo or some computer game.
Yeah, and unfortunately,
anyway,
you know, the more that people don't take notice, you know, you end up with almost like a state where, you know, the government doesn't have to watch everybody and keep everybody under surveillance, because the irony is nobody cares. You know, they just want to go home, close the curtains, and watch reality TV. You know, it's almost like the creation of a slave state, but where you don't have to enslave them. They're enslaving themselves through ignorance and whatever. So.
Soma. Nick, the music's going to come up. When we come back, let's move on to censored photos and faces on Mars. I know I'm really interested in getting more details about that.
Okay. Alrighty.
I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Nick Redfern. His website is nickredfern.com. His book, The NASA Conspiracies. And we'll be back talking about faces on Mars after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.